Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. And I'm Jeff Sachs, and happy to be with all of you today. And we're going to be speaking about the Millennium Development Goals and what they've meant and how they have been operationalized. If you have questions, please in the Google Hangout type your questions, and I will do my best to get to them, and we'll have a good open discussion. So the MDG period has been an extremely interesting and on the whole fruitful period for development. It began in September 2000 at what was called the Millennium Summit, which was the greeting of the new millennium. And it continues really through a year from now. There will be a summit next year, September 2015, to inaugurate the Sustainable Development Goals. So the baton will pass from the MDGs to the SDGs a year from now, and we'll enter a new phase. So we're almost at the end of the MDG period, 1 year to go. And there's a lot of thinking and stock taking, and also a strong desire to learn from the MDG period for the future SDGs. I've been serving since early 2002, since the beginning of 2002, really the fall of 2001, as special advisor to the UN Secretary General on the MDGs, so I've watched the process all the way through. And I advised Kofi Annan when he was Secretary General, and then when Ban Ki-moon became Secretary General in 2007, he kindly asked me to continue in this position. So I've seen the process all the way through. And I also had the chance to direct a special program for Secretary General Kofi Annan called the UN Millennium Project. And I've asked you to read the summary report of the UN Millennium Project to get an idea of how I and colleagues thought about the MDGs along the way. So the big question is, have they been helpful? Have they made a difference? If so, in what way? In what ways have they succeeded? In what ways have they failed? What can we learn from the experience of what I like to call goal-based development? The idea that you set goals, that these are especially internationally agreed goals, and then you work towards the fulfillment of those goals. As I think I said in the opening lecture, I'm a fan of that approach. I think it really helps to concentrate the mind, the thinking, the strategies, the activities. It helps to mobilize energy around these ambitions and aspirations, and it helps in part to mobilize financial and other resources as well. The idea that you have goals, now what do we do to achieve them? So just a bit about the background to the MDGs, and then how we thought about them, and what's happened, and then open it up for discussion. There have been goals for a long time at the international system level. Sometimes they're embedded in treaties, like the UN Framework Convention for Climate Change. Sometimes they are aspirational. They are statements by world leaders or resolutions of the General Assembly. And there have been broad ambitions on development. For instance, in the 1960s, the UN Decade of Development. Development itself, as a framework and a field and an approach, is a kind of new idea of the post-World War II, post-colonial era. The idea that countries that were late in industrializing should catch up, and that a specific field of then called economic development, and now moving to sustainable development, should help them to do so. And early on in this process, the concepts of development assistance were initiated by the United States at the end of the 40s and 50s, really in the context of the Cold War, I would say, partly as part of the competition between the US and the Soviet Union, partly on the idea that one could trigger industrialization in some way. Japan played an absolutely huge role in the thinking about this because Japan was the Asian country that first industrialized and that led the way in showing how to quickly close the gap with the higher income countries. It did it twice in a way, unfortunately, once in the Meiji Restoration after 1868, and then the second time after the defeat in World War II. Japan had to get off after a devastating defeat. It had to develop and rebuild and develop, and it did so in the 1960s. So that was a lot of inspiration for other countries. Look, we can catch up, we can industrialize, and so forth. The era of the 1980s and 90s, broadly speaking, was constructing the world economy by countries dropping their closed economy philosophy by the end of the communist closed economy, centrally planned systems, and by the idea that examples such as Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and so forth showed that it was possible to develop rapidly on the basis of export-led development. And so that became a kind of idea. Now, it was taken in the US and in the US-led institutions of the day, the IMF and the World Bank, as a kind of a free market model, what became called the structural adjustment era. And the structural adjustment era was really an approach that the US pushed hard to say, free up your economies for trade and finance, get your budgets under control, let markets operate, and development will take hold. There are some truths in what was said, and there were a lot of dramatic simplifications and very harmful ideas as well. Basically, the structural adjustment era pushed a free market approach rather than a mixed economy approach. Free market approach meaning get government out of the way, and a mixed economy approach saying that there's role for markets, there's role for government, there's role for civil society. Of course, we are advocating, and in our discussions, much more a mixed economy approach where different kinds of institutions and different kinds of stakeholders play different complementary roles in the economy. But for the 80s and the 90s, this was much more a kind of free market approach. It failed in some very significant ways, and one of the biggest failures was in the social sectors, where health and education really went into reverse in many poor countries during the 80s and 90s, partly under budget squeezes that were part of these structural adjustment programs. So by the end of the 1990s, there was a sense that something was really off track. And the Millennium Development Goals emerged not only because of the new millennium, but because of the sense that one needed a different philosophy of development. And the UN stood a bit in opposition or counterposition to the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, in those days. And the UN said, we want to propose a development approach more based around human development. Of course, UNDP was pushing the Human Development Index and the idea that health and education are core parts of development, and that the structural adjustment era had gone too far in the free market approach. The MDGs were put on the table by Kofi Annan based on expert advice and largely drawn from agreements that had been reached in various UN summits during the 1990s. Agreements on health and education, women's empowerment, and so forth. Most of those summit meetings like in Beijing or in Cairo or other of those big 1990s summits, had set goals for the year 2000. Kofi Annan and his advisors updated them, put a timeline generally to 2015, and then incorporated them in a draft, first a long document called We the Peoples, and then in an outcome document for the UN negotiations called the Millennium Declaration, which you will presumably have read. And within that were a list of goals, specific quantified targets in paragraphs 19 and 20. They weren't called the Millennium Development Goals at that moment. It was just that world leaders adopted the Millennium Declaration. That was September 2000. Then in the spring of 2001, the UN member states were told, by the way, you've adopted a set of goals. Take a look at paragraphs 19 and 20. We'll put those under one rubric called the Millennium Development Goals, and please pursue those. And that's how the MDGs emerged really in the spring of 2001. And the very bright side was that these were a set of goals focused on extreme poverty. And so it was drawing the world's attention to the very poor. Of course, that begs the question, which we've already started to raise: what does poverty mean? How do you define it? What is extreme poverty? What are other definitions? And we know that there's one definition, which is a pure income definition, which the World Bank keeps, which is now defined as $1.25 per person per day at purchasing power parity in 2006 dollars, I think it is. And they keep the scorecard on that. And can someone check if it's 2008 or 2006? But that's the scorecard that the World Bank keeps. That scorecard is 6 periods out of date, because the most recent data we have is really from 2009, so we don't even know exactly what's going on. There's a 2005 in that? Okay, 2005, sorry. So it's $1.25 a day per capita. By the way, a lot of very great difficulties in actually measuring this. This is mostly measured by consumption rather than income. So there are lots of definitional issues, lots of technical, very serious measurement problems. But in any event, that's the standard on an income basis. But what the MDGs did was implicitly say, no, extreme poverty is more than that. It includes income poverty, but it includes other things. Are people hungry? Are children in school? Are kids dying in early age, specifically under the age of 5? Are mothers dying in pregnancy-related deaths at childbirth or because of pregnancy or in immediate postnatal circumstances? Do people have access to basic amenities like safe water and sanitation? And taken as a whole, these Millennium Development Goals defined implicitly an idea of extreme poverty as meaning extreme deprivation in one of a number of dimensions. I always found that to be a very, very important aspect of these goals, one of the captivating elements of them, which is that it moved beyond the $1.25 per person per day definition, which is a very narrow standard and not a very realistic vision of what poverty really means. So the MDGs put a broad sense of poverty on the table and implicitly defined extreme poverty as meaning unable to meet basic needs in health, in food security, in schooling, in disease control, and access to safe, basic safe infrastructure like clean water, or implicitly cooking fuels and so forth. If you look at the goals, they are even more ambitious than that in a couple of ways. Rhetorically, MDG number 7 is about environmental sustainability broadly. So it's a kind of sustainable development framework which says it's not only about income, It's also about social equality, like gender equality. It's also about environmental sustainability. But in fact, MDG 7 could never really carry the political weight of the environmental agenda. And so in practical terms, the environmental agenda remained focused within the climate change treaty or the biodiversity treaty, and MDG 7 really became mostly about specifics of water, sanitation, slum dwelling, and so forth, just as a very practical matter. And then MDG 8 is a very interesting amalgamation of the idea that to achieve a reduction of poverty, one needs to have a global partnership, or we call it a global compact at the beginning, between rich and poor countries. And that would involve development assistance. It would involve restructuring excessive debts of poor countries. It would involve access to technologies, especially the new information technologies. It would involve access to essential medicines. It's quite a nice list of things that are enabling conditions or necessary conditions for implementation of the MDGs. So these were adopted in September. They were made known as a defining group of goals in the spring of 2001. They occurred in a context where there was great dissatisfaction with the prevailing development ethos that had been the Bretton Woods-led structural adjustment era. And there was also the very specific reality of the AIDS pandemic, because AIDS was the raging disease of the time, a phenomenon that is as stark and startling as one can find. AIDS was discovered as a new disease around 1981, and the identification of the pathogen, which is a virus, the human immunodeficiency virus, was identified in 1983 and 84. Yet, when you use the genome of the virus to ask where did this come from, you can say that this is a mutation of a chimpanzee virus, simian immunodeficiency virus, SIV, and by comparing the genome of the SIV and the HIV, you see certain base pairs of the genome mutated, and that's what made it a human disease. And by the number of changes of these base pairs in the genome, you have a clock, because random mutations occur at a certain fairly known, understood rate, and it suggests that the first HIV virus probably took place, the transmission from chimpanzee to human probably took place around 1930. I always found that incredible. Here was a disease that was not known for 50 years because it was Africans suffering from it. No one was counting, no one was looking, no one was understanding why many people must have been dying. And when the disease was then identified by Gallo and Montagnier as a new virus in the mid-1980s, and some epidemiology started, lo and behold, there were millions of Africans infected. This was the epicenter, because the passage of SIV to HIV probably took place in the equatorial rainforest sometime around 1930, maybe in Gabon or in Congo or someplace in that region, and Africa was the epicenter. So the HIV epidemic was also a looming, horrific disaster. Ebola is our current looming disaster, but by 1999, 2000, 2001, HIV was a lethal disease that had infected tens of millions of people already. So it was a completely out of control disease, and the MDGs need to be seen in that context as well. Not only had poverty not declined in Africa for 20 years, not only was the structural adjustment era not working, not only were health conditions not adequate, there were actually raging epidemics. HIV, drug-resistant malaria, and drug-resistant tuberculosis, 3 huge epidemics that were underway in the year 2000 when the MDGs were announced. That's why, in part, disease plays such a central role in framing the MDGs. MDGs 4, 5, and 6 are about public health. MDG 4 about children, MDG 5 maternal, and MDG 6 disease control. And so that was very much in the minds of everybody at the time. In general, we live in a very noisy world. Attention is 99% of the story. It's almost impossible to get sustained attention on anything. And so it's easy to announce goals and to forget them the next day. And I suspect that when the Millennium Declaration was signed, I don't think that any of the 163 leaders that signed that expected anything to last out of the Declaration other than a nice photo opportunity at the start of the new millennium. And when the MDGs were announced, nobody paid much heed to them. And the question really was, could they have some traction? Could they have some staying power? And I think that this remains a very interesting, important question for us. Kofi Annan called me in the fall of 2001 and basically he said, please help us, help me, help the UN to make these operational. So that was, I think, an incredible mandate and offer. Here are nice goals. They could sit up there on the wall as nice things to try to do. And Kofi Annan said, let's find practical pathways to achieve these goals. And the UN Millennium Project is very much around the idea of what practically can be done. Everything's speaking here. I don't know. Okay, anyway, let's hope that the machines quiet down for a moment and that everybody can hear. This is a big question. Can you plan the end of poverty? Can you create a strategy? To what extent is this a plannable phenomenon, or is it something that either does or doesn't happen? Of course, my view is we can do a lot. We can plan a lot. We can identify strategies. We can figure out things that need to be done. Many of the critics of this whole process, and my own critics like Bill Easterly and others, say that's planning doesn't work. It's a failure. It's bound to be futile and not succeed. That is a kind of debate that permeates pretty much all public policy. What can be done? To what extent does organized, structured, forward-looking activity help? To what extent are events driven by market forces or technological changes or politics that are outside of the control of these kinds of conceptual approaches? Of course, I'm not a central planner. I spent part of my life dismantling central plans in Central and Eastern Europe, and I was at the time known as a free market ideologue, which was absurd, because when you take central plans, what you do is you dismantle them. That doesn't mean you don't want any plans. On the other hand, the idea that you shouldn't have any plans at all, which is an American free market idea, I find equally absurd. The idea we can't think ahead, we can't make plans, we can't make structured strategic approaches, I find also to be wrong. So that's why I always argue for a mixed approach. Certain things are self-organizing, market forces, and so forth, and other things are subject to plan, to calculation, to deliberate approaches. In general, I would argue that to achieve the MDGs is an investment challenge, that economic development is largely about investing in productive capital of society, but a complex investment challenge, because part of the capital is private business capital. It's what markets do. Part of the capital is human capital, health, skills, nutrition, education. Part of the capital is natural capital. It's making sure that ecosystems work properly. Part of the capital is infrastructure capital, roads, power grids, fiber optic, airports, seaports. So saying that this is an investment problem doesn't solve it. It makes it quite complicated. And my general take about a mixed economy and about investment is that most of these investments are complementary, meaning that it's not a choice. Should we invest in natural capital or business capital? Should we invest in human capital or infrastructure? It's and rather than or. Complementary means that each one raises the productivity and effectiveness of the other kinds of investment. And that's why I generally have favored a holistic approach that says we should combine many kinds of activities together, health, education, infrastructure, and so forth, because each one benefits the others. There are many arguments about all of this. Can you really do something so complicated? Is this just hubris? Is it what failed in the Soviet planning system? And so on. I think many of these kinds of arguments, frankly, are rhetorical arguments. They're not real. Because real says, what do you do in practice to address specific problems? And then working pragmatically, you're led to realize that in order to succeed in one area or another area, you need to accomplish many things to make the whole process work. My view is that by solving the specific goals, you're led to a kind of pragmatic, holistic, integrated approach, which relies both on markets and on non-market activities. So the Millennium Project was a 4-year effort from 2002 to 2006 that engaged hundreds of specialists in many different fields. In agriculture, with Glenn Denning playing a huge role, in public health, with Sonia playing a huge role, in malaria control, AIDS control, in infrastructure, and so on. And the idea was, what can be done practically? And the idea in each of the MDGs was, how would one actually achieve such a goal? Now, the MDGs are just stated as cut poverty by half by 2015. It's not even stated explicitly as cut poverty by half in your country. So the first thing to do was to say this applies country by country. And that was already a particular step. We said every country should plan to do this. We said that every country should make a strategy. We said that the rich countries should indeed partner with the poor countries, and that companies should partner as well in this process, for example, by making their medicines available at low cost to low-income countries. And the focus was specifically on the poorest countries and mostly on Africa, I would say. I always said that the MDGs were about 70% focused on Africa. That wasn't because 70% of the poverty was in Africa, but I would say 70% of the needed effort was in Africa to break through various barriers and to confront the AIDS pandemic and so forth. So that became the general framework. And in order to accomplish any of these goals, you need a understanding of what are the dynamics that are driving the outcome, whether it's people living below $1.25 a day, MDG 1A, or people that are food insecure, MDG 1B, or children dying before their 5th birthday, or controlling the AIDS pandemic, or getting kids in school, and keeping a big economic and political and developmental picture around that so that one is operating in a framework that is realistic from the point of view of how economies function, how global politics functions, and so on. It's a big task. Not just a big task, it's a big global challenge. And there is no strong single institution that guides any of this also. So this is all in a world of tremendous distraction, decentralization, and where poverty is not intrinsically the top issue on people's minds. The poor generally, almost by definition, are almost voiceless and powerless. And they don't command the media, they don't command politics, they don't command resources. And so the idea of fighting extreme poverty is a bit of an uphill battle to begin with, because you don't have a lot of wind in the sails when you're helping people who don't have any market demand, who don't have any media empires in their hip pocket, who don't control the politicians and so forth. So it's not a simple matter, even if all the technical issues were strongly understood. I'll say one quick thing about the broad end of poverty, and then one specific thing about health, and then I promise to stop and to address some questions. Ending income poverty is partly about the general conditions of economic development, and partly about the specific attention to the needs of the poorest parts of society. So poverty ends in countries that achieve sustained economic growth and that invest in the poor, both. And investing in the poor has two consequences. One is it directs resources to those who are most in need. And second, by also freeing those most in need from desperation, it makes those people much more productive for the general economic development. So investing in the poor is both a strategy of distributional benefit for those most in need, and it's also a growth strategy, because the poor don't play an effective role in an economy unless they're helped to do so by having the skills, the working capital, the basic equipment, the health to do so. So investing in the needs of very poor people has both a distributional and a growth promoting aspect. When you think about the promotion of growth in low-income countries, of course it depends. Which country? What are the problems? What are the barriers? That's the checklist, the clinical economics that I always argue for, the need for a differential diagnosis. There is no simple answer, but if there's one overriding fact or set of facts, I would put the following on the table. First, most poor countries are agricultural, and so there's a big rural component. Raising rural productivity and rural health is almost inevitably part of fighting extreme poverty in almost any African country or South Asian country. Second, most development involves, over the long term, a shift of the economy from rural to urban. As rural areas become more productive, the proportion of the population engaged in farming doesn't go up because it's more productive, it goes down, for the simple reason that food is a necessity. The share of the population devoted to food production is the share that's needed to meet those needs. When farmers become more productive, so that instead of just feeding themselves and their own households, they can feed 2 households, then the share that's needed to feed the country falls by half. If one farm family can feed 4 households, then only 1/4 of the population is needed in basic staple food production. If farmers are incredibly productive, as they are in the United States, with huge farms, lots of machinery, and very high yields, then 1% of the population can feed the rest. In general, therefore, development is both about empowering rural areas, but also expecting urbanization to take place. And then finally, in order to accomplish all of that, one needs human skills, healthy populations, children that get an education, and one needs infrastructure, roads, power, and so on, telecoms. So there's no one answer. It's a more complicated set of challenges. But in general, with a complicated set of problems, take that complication, break it up into its subparts, recognize the division of labor. Not one central planning agency does all of those things or needs to, but each of them needs to be attended to in various ways. And when places are very poor, generally government can't do the things that it normally would do in a more affluent setting because it doesn't have the budget to do it. And international partners are needed, therefore, to help meet the financial and institutional needs to enable this kind of complicated investment strategy to work. In 2002, after the MDGs were announced, there was a conference in Monterrey, Mexico in March 2002 to set a financial framework for the MDGs. Governments pledged to raise their development assistance. In one of the paragraphs of the Monterrey Consensus, they said, "We urge all developed countries that have not done so to make concrete efforts to achieve the international goal of 0.7% of gross national income as official development assistance." So ODA is aid, government aid, and governments pledge to reach 0.7% of GDP in aid. In the US, we have a $17 trillion economy. So 1% of that is 170 billion. 0.7 of 1% of that is about 110 billion. Our actual aid is about 30 billion. Closing that gap would be that extra 80 billion, roughly. Okay? So governments pledged to do that. In 2005, at the G8 summit in Gleneagles, Scotland, they promised to double the aid to Africa by the year 2010. So the idea of the MDGs was to create a financial framework in which these increased investments could take place. In general, most of that didn't happen. There was one area of big increase of development aid, and that was health, through new institutions like the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, TB, and Malaria, and the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunizations. But in other areas, such as education, water, sanitation, schools, there was very little increase of development aid. Once, soon after Gleneagles, I went to the Ministry of Finance in Germany, and I met with the senior German official, and I said, "Okay, you've agreed to double aid by 2010. What's the plan?" And he looked at me and he said, "Mr. Sachs, you don't take that seriously, do you?" And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, come on, you don't take that seriously. That's a statement." I said, "But your chancellor just agreed to that." He said, "Oh, that's just political talk." So this is, of course, a reality. There's a lot of cynicism. Statements are made, casual commitments are made. The world does not have strong accountability components. Achieving this kind of goal-based approach depends, therefore, on good technical ideas, on politics, on social activism, on that glimmer of humanity we expect in finance ministries and elsewhere to get the job done. It's not easy. What's the balance sheet at the end of 14 years? The balance sheet is increased attention to poverty more than anyone imagined inside this whole activity at the beginning of the process. Very few goals remain talked about even 14 years after they're enunciated, but the MDGs remained as organizing principles. Second, a tremendous amount of technical know-how went into the design of country-level and international programs to achieve the MDGs. This is without question. Public health, in my view, was the most successful of all of the areas where knowledge was mobilized to say, let's meet MDGs 4, 5, and 6. But there was also mobilization around agriculture, mobilization around infrastructure, mobilization around education, though not as much as there should have been. Certain goals have been achieved in the aggregate. For example, interestingly, the goal to cut income poverty by half was actually achieved, mainly because China grew so fast and China had so much poverty in 1990 and the poverty rate came down. So if you look at the developing countries as a whole, the poverty rate went from 43% down to 21% in 2010, and we don't know what it is now because the World Bank's very late. But we should find out soon, and I would expect that it's probably 16 or 17% at the current in 2014. So that's a big gain. I thought for a long time the MDGs didn't have too much to do with China's success because China was barreling along. But interestingly, for me, a key minister in China said to me just a couple of months ago, oh, you would be surprised, but in the cabinet, the MDGs played a very important role in the health reform, for example, in getting China to undertake the health reform. I didn't know that, even though I'm supposed to know that. But it was a good thing to find out after the fact that indeed these goals had, even in China, which was so dynamic, even when the goals were set, that the goals did have an effect even in China's own policy consideration. I think the final statement I would make is that despite the fact that many promises were not kept, aid was not sufficient, many countries did not do a good job in implementing, while others did, and the progress has been incomplete, the balance sheet is generally viewed as very positive and surprisingly positive in the sense that 14 years on, the fight against poverty continues. The MDGs became the organizing principle for public response, and they gave the idea that targeted goal-based development could play a useful role. And that's precisely why SDGs were advocated in June 2012 at the Rio Plus 20 summit, because the MDGs were viewed as a success compared to only working through treaties as the environmental side had done. That's why we will have SDGs, because the MDGs have been viewed as a good motivating principle and very helpful for moving the agenda along. So that's my opening 5 minutes. And let me see if I can take a couple of questions. There are hundreds of them.
The ones at the top are the most upvoted.
Oh, sorry, I have to go that direction. Okay. Okay, so just select it. So Suman Ray asks, what were some of the questions asked to the communities where the Millennium Villages were implemented in order to test out the MDGs? What kind of tools are being used to ensure eventual self-sufficiency in the Millennium Villages? I think you'll be talking about the Millennium Villages throughout the next weeks, and at Columbia in the next hour as well. But basically, the Millennium Villages emerged in 2005 with the idea of putting the recommendations of the UN Millennium Project to work on a small scale to show what could be done if these basic principles of goal-based development and investment were made. So 10 sites in 10 countries from East to West Africa were selected, and this project, like the MDGs, will come to an end next year and be evaluated, but we're in the 9th year of this project, and the idea is a holistic, goal-based approach. What are the goals for the Millennium Villages? To achieve the Millennium Development Goals. So those are the goals that were set. We asked the villages, do you want to participate? They said, absolutely. We'd like to achieve the Millennium Development Goals, but the MDGs were the framework, not specific goals. Of course, making them making them proper in the context is part of the work, but the goals themselves came from the international side and are localized in the Millennium Villages. The idea is investments in health, education, local infrastructure, with community leadership and partnership with government, and to see whether small investments, for example, in the health sector, can lead to big improvements in outcomes. We argued in the Millennium Project that if you really could get the 0.7 committed, that would be enough to achieve the MDGs. The world only got to 0.3, so we don't even have that test, unfortunately. Couldn't raise the full 0.7. In fact, barely could make the needle move in most countries in terms of the overall aid amounts other than in health. But in the MDGs, the idea was put in something not quite 0.7, but something closer to like 0.5 would be roughly even a little bit less than that, and see how far one could get. Our sense is quite far, but probably like the world, not achieving all of the MDGs in all of the places, depending on local circumstances, difficulties, isolation, national politics, and the ability to mobilize the investment financing in them. There will be an evaluation next year in considerable detail, and in all of the sites, the host governments, both at the national and the local level, are taking over the clinics and the schools and the community health worker systems and the water systems and other systems that were developed during the MDG period to keep them sustainable.
Can you click done?
Hmm?
Can you click done?
Click done, yes. Thank you, Suman. Let me go to this one from Yemi Zambrano. How to create lasting social structures and self-directed in countries with extreme poverty in order to avoid economic dependence, especially what would be the strategy in countries where the problem is corruption of their governments. So first of all, the idea of dependence, I think, needs to be put in context. The basic idea of development assistance is not to live on development assistance forever, which would be the case if the development assistance were mainly emergency food aid, or not even emergency, if we're consumption. The idea is to invest the development assistance to enable a community or a country to break free of poverty so that it doesn't have to keep going back for more. So I would say this is the philosophy is the opposite of a dependence approach, because the idea is use the financing for investment, not for consumption. It's strange, some of the big critics of me and of our project say, why are you wasting all that time? Just give money to people. So cash transfers, even unconditional cash transfers. To my mind, that's dependence. But somehow in this funny business, because people like free markets, giving money seems like good, but saying use it to build a clinic seems bad to some people. I find that upside down. I'd much rather say we'll give money if you actually build a clinic rather than here, have some cash. That's my own view, that if you want to build dependence, just give money to people. If you want to build a way out, build schools, have teachers, get kids in school, protect children with bed nets, and so forth. When countries are highly corrupt, like the United States, you have a big problem. So, you know, there's no simple answer. Washington is just rife with corruption, and so we can't get decent governance in our country. And this is a really serious, very serious problem indeed. And I don't know what the answer is. Many poor countries are called corrupt, but they're just poor. And if they were given help, they would do better. So there's a tendency of rich people to say poor people are corrupt. I can tell you from my experience, rich people are a lot more corrupt than poor people. Poor people can't afford to be corrupt. Rich people can afford lots of corruption. And so I'm not too impressed by the usual categorization. What is true, though, is that good governance costs money, because good governance requires information systems. It requires skilled people. It requires feedback. It requires monitoring. None of that's free. So like everything else, when you're in a cash-strapped situation, things don't work right. When our bodies are starved, literally, they can't function. All systems break down. When a cell is deprived of nutrients, it breaks down. When a society is living at the edge of survival, it breaks down, including government. But I consider that a problem of poverty, not a problem of corruption. It's easy to say, oh, look at how corrupt. But with more funding, the key is create systems. A good system says we're going to give money for a purpose, and then we're going to check whether that money was delivered that way, and if it wasn't, we're going to take some kind of remedial action. If there's no feedback, no measurement, no direction, then of course there's going to be corruption. Everyone will steal, believe me, anywhere. Again, not just Washington, anywhere, if you don't control it. So of course you need to build a management system, an information system. Don't trust, respect people, but don't trust them. In other words, okay, we have a bargain. We're going to help. You're going to build a clinic. I respect you, lead, but we're going to check. This is basic. And so I think that this is really the key point that I would summarize at a very general level. Many governments are corrupt. It's often, and sometimes the corruption is very entrenched, and there is no easy solution in those cases. Social activism, disclosure rules, embarrassment, pressure, failure to meet goals, holding governments accountable, all of those things are necessary. But you can see, and again, I mean it quite seriously, the United States is in a sea of corruption right now because our politicians depend on large campaign contributions to get reelected. So only the rich have a say in our politics right now, by and large. So that's a kind of deeply entrenched corruption for which no one has found an easy answer yet.
Done. Click done, please.
Done?
Done? Can you click done?
Done. Okay, Yami, we're done. Okay. Thanks. I think we have also reached the end of the hour.
Oh, no, we have until 9.
Oops. We have a problem. We're done, I told you.
Professor, we have until 9:15.
Oh, we have till 9:15?
Yeah.
Oh, fine. Oh, good. Okay, great. Okay. Okay. So this is a good question. Ashley Gay, are the quick win strategies proposed in 2005 really sustainable? Yay! Good. Good question, Ashley. Are the quick win strategies really sustainable? For example, what happens in reported malaria incidents when distributed bed nets wear out? So the answer is you give more bed nets. And you keep doing that until either it's just incorporated naturally in the public health system, or you have to do it with enough rounds of development aid until countries can do it on their own. When you start something, if you want the full line to ultimate complete solution and success of a complex task, don't start, because you never know in the end when and how exactly it's going to be fulfilled. Everything we do in complex settings is open-ended. So when 1.5 million children or so were dying of malaria in 2005, and bed nets at very low cost could save a lot of lives, I said, let's do this. And people said, well, what will happen in 2010 or 2015? And I said, are you kidding? We'll figure that out in 2010 or 2015. But if you want every answer now, well, I can tell you the sure answer is 1.5 million kids will die this year. for no reason. And so I don't find most of such arguments very persuasive, though this is a very standard question. Why? Because there's a context to it. The context is, what was the cost of giving this bed net distribution? So let's just do it for a moment. You needed approximately maybe 300 million bed nets total. And the cost of the bed nets was $6 a bed net. So that's $1.8 billion. And the bed nets last roughly 4 years, let's say. They maybe are on the package it says 5 years, but they develop holes or they rip or something else. So maybe 4 years. So that's $450 million a year. $450 million a year is about 6 hours of what the Pentagon spends. So how could this be a problem? This is a tiny amount of money. And when you think about it, there are 1 billion people in the rich countries. And so 450 million a year is 45 cents per person in the rich countries. So you can't come close to getting a cup of coffee for that once a year. You know, it's too small. And that's why I didn't worry about this issue. The general idea, again, of all of this is that development takes place. If we knew that certain countries were permanently poor, then we would need a permanent aid system, I think. But I don't think that is true of almost any place in the world. Perhaps the most difficult, most remote place where you can't imagine quite why anyone could ever be living there, it could be the case, but for most places in the world, I don't know of most places condemned to permanent poverty. And so the idea is help along the way until they can stand on their own feet. The argument is that by making the targeted investments, you accelerate that process. By not making the investments, then my argument would be that many of these places are trapped in poverty, and so it's not really solving anything. It's just chronic crisis. So my thinking about that question was, even if there have to be 2 or 3 rounds of this, it's not such a big deal. This is low cost, high return. And in most countries, basic health interventions like this, and I would say in the US, the equivalent to a bed net is a vaccine. Children are routinely vaccinated as part of ongoing public programs. So we don't say, what is the sustainability of DPT vaccine in this country? What is the sustainability of measles vaccine? Rather, we say every child should have those, and the public health system will pay for them. We don't say that very well in the United States because we're almost incoherent on this issue. But in many other countries, it's said very routinely that here are things that are just part of the public health system and they'll be paid for each time. In the case of malaria control, I want countries to take on these responsibilities as soon as they can afford to. And so I want to see development and economic growth take hold so that what now are budgets beyond their means become budgets within their means. But until that happens, I'd be happy with rounds of bed net distribution. So let's take one more. Oh, done. Wait a minute. Oh, okay, good. So how do you approach and ensure the effectiveness of the global partnership for development while the major contributors are in financial crisis? Are emergent economies in a position to step up and contribute, asks Yadi Ruiz Rodriguez. Partnership is very fragile. When we speak about the international community, there's barely a community. we use that phrase to speak of, say, the 193 member states of the United Nations. But think of all the wars underway right now, and think of all of the backlash in many countries. We don't want to think about anything about foreigners and so forth. So all these partnerships are fragile, and I think that one way to make them less fragile is to demonstrate what can actually be accomplished by making them more practical. And that's why I think the MDGs are interesting. The malaria control actually worked in the end. You see, to come back to the bed net example, when I proposed mass distribution of bed nets, one of the answers from Easterly and others, and the critics, said, well, this won't work. Not just how will it be sustainable, but it won't work. It won't work because the nets won't be used, or if they're received for free, they won't be valued by the people, or people won't know what to do with them, or they will sell them, or they will use them as fishing nets, or they will use them as wedding veils, and so forth. Honestly, everything that you can think of, and then 10 times more, are said about everything, usually without a clue. Okay, but this kind of criticism is normal. The bed nets were distributed, and malaria came down by half. I don't know whether it will stay down unless we continue to get these rounds, but it worked. Clearly, people used them, and there was a lot of effect. That's the best case for saying we can do more. I hope today President Obama will announce a massive increase of America's response to the Ebola epidemic. That would be a hugely positive initiative, one of the most important of his administration, in my view, from what I can read. If he does that, one of the reasons is that public health initiatives have worked up until now, so there's a sense that this would be effective also. And so one of the ways to build a partnership is to show that something can be done, and to then try to really hammer home the point that what can be done in a demonstration can be done on a larger scale as well. But these partnerships are changing coalitions, and they're easily broken, they're easily distracted, and I think the situation today is much more distracted than it was 14 years ago, actually, because there are more wars. The multilateral system is weaker. Yadi mentions the financial crisis. It's true that the rich countries don't feel economically so good, but I wouldn't call it currently a financial crisis. Part of the big problem is that the rich generally avoid taxation, and this is a big problem in terms of being able to mobilize the levels of resources needed. I recently made a little illustration of this in an extreme way. The 85 people in the world, the richest 85 people, have a net worth of $2 trillion, just 85 people. And if that money were put into an endowment, like a university endowment or like the Gates Foundation, the payout of that would be $100 billion a year, 5%. $100 billion could actually fund totally the fight against AIDS, TB, Ebola, unsafe childbirth, every other health condition you can imagine, unsafe water, lack of access to electricity, schooling for all children through secondary level. You could do everything. That's just 85 people. So I don't call it a financial crisis in the generalized sense. I think it's a crisis of politics, governance, income inequality, and so on, and irresponsibility, but not a generalized financial crisis. But that doesn't deny the basic point that finding the ways to do this in the real world are not simple. Okay, I think we have reached the end of the hour. I'll just summarize by saying that the very strong sense I get within that community of nations inside the General Assembly of the UN, the 193 countries, is that goal-based development has proven its worth, even if it's imperfect, even if it's limited, even if it sometimes stumbles. The idea of setting goals, determining systematically and rigorously how best to pursue them, taking a multidimensional investment framework of physical capital, business capital, infrastructure capital, natural capital, human capital, social capital, is becoming more increasingly established. And while the idea of the MDGs was a unified fight against extreme poverty, the SDGs will be a unified, universal fight for sustainable development. So I think we're on the track. I think we can learn a lot from the MDGs, and we will be talking about that kind of goal-based development in the weeks ahead. Have a wonderful week, everybody, and see you next week.
Thank you, Jeff. And this brings us to the end of the Global Classroom. Goodbye.